The cashier's eyes narrowed. The card had declined, twice. Big Shaq, a millionaire, an icon, stood at the register, facing a question he never expected. "Sir, is this card even yours?" The crowd went silent. Phones went up. Whispers spread. Shaq could have ended it in seconds, but he didn't, because he wanted to see just how far they would take it. What happened next had the whole store watching, and the entire world talking. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun hung high over the quiet town of Brighton Hills, its golden rays spilling onto the streets like warm honey. It was a place where life moved at an easy pace, where shopkeepers knew customers by name, and where small moments of kindness weren't rare. Shaquille O'Neal, known to the world as Big Shaq, was a legend, an NBA champion, a businessman, and a beloved public figure. But beyond the fame, he was just a man who believed in humility. Despite his millions, he enjoyed life's simple pleasures. And today, those pleasures included a trip to a small, locally owned grocery store. Dressed in a loose gray hoodie, sweatpants, and sneakers that could barely contain his size 22 feet, Shaq ducked slightly as he entered the automatic doors of Harper's Market. The scent of fresh bread and ground coffee filled the air, blending with the faint melody of an old-school jazz track playing through the speakers. A few customers cast curious glances his way, doing double takes but hesitating to approach. He was hard to miss, standing at over 7 feet tall, but the way he carried himself, calm, unassuming, made it clear he wasn't seeking attention. He liked it that way. Shaq strolled through the aisles, nodding at an elderly woman struggling with a cart. He stepped forward, effortlessly pushing it along for her. "You're too kind, young man," she said, smiling up at him. "Always gotta help out," Shaq responded warmly. He moved toward the bakery section, where a teenage worker, Noah, was stacking loaves onto a wooden shelf. The kid's eyes widened when he recognized the former basketball star. "Wait, you're..." Shaq pressed a massive finger to his lips, grinning. "Shh, Noah. I'm just here for some bread, man." Noah chuckled nervously, lowering his voice. "Right, got it. You need help with anything?" "Nah, I'm good. But I appreciate you, little man." Shaq grabbed a couple of loaves, some fresh fruit, and a gallon of almond milk before heading toward the checkout. That's when he noticed the cashier, Blake. Blake looked about 30, with neatly combed brown hair and a crisp store uniform. His expression was neutral, almost indifferent, as he scanned items for a young couple in front of Shaq. When it was finally Shaq's turn, Blake barely glanced up. Shaq placed his groceries on the belt and reached into his pocket, pulling out a sleek black credit card. "Good afternoon," he said with a polite nod. Blake muttered something under his breath, scanning the items methodically. When he finished, he tapped the total on the screen. "That'll be $48.76. Shaq inserted his card. The machine beeped once, then flashed an error message. "Declined." Blake raised an eyebrow. "Want to try that again?" Shaq frowned, glancing at the screen. It had to be a mistake. He reinserted the card. Again, the same message. "Declined." A few people behind him in line stirred, shifting their weight impatiently. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head in mild disbelief. "That's weird." Blake's fingers drummed against the counter. "Got another card?" "Yeah, but this one should be working." Shaq tried to laugh it off, reaching for his wallet. Blake's expression hardened slightly. "Sometimes banks block big transactions. Maybe it flagged your purchase." Shaq met his gaze, catching an undertone that made his stomach tighten. "For $48? Blake shrugged, but his eyes lingered on Shaq's hoodie, his casual attire. That's when it clicked. Shaq had seen that look before. It was the look that questioned whether he belonged. Shaq took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "All right, let me try my other card." As he reached for it, a woman 2 lanes over nudged her husband, whispering. A man behind Shaq shifted, his gaze flicking toward the security guard standing by the exit. The moment had changed. The air had thickened. Shaq swiped his second card. Declined. The sound of the beep felt louder this time, cutting through the quiet hum of the store. Blake leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice but keeping an edge to it. Sir, are you sure these are your cards? A flicker of heat ran up Shaq's spine. He stared at Blake, searching his face. There it was. Doubt, suspicion. Shaq could feel the eyes on him now, scanning him, judging him. A man his size, his skin tone, in a small-town store with a declined card. It was a script he had seen play out too many times, even for a man of his status. He straightened, his jaw tightening, but he kept his voice steady. Why wouldn't they be my cards? Blake hesitated. A slight pause, barely noticeable, but there. It's just store policy. When cards decline back-to-back, we have to verify. Shaq's grip on the counter firmed. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The wrong reaction, the wrong tone, and this could escalate. He had lived long enough to know how quickly things could spiral. He forced a small, tight smile. Then go ahead and verify. Blake pursed his lips, nodding slightly. I'll have to call the manager. Shaq exhaled, resisting the urge to rub his temples. This was ridiculous. Over $48? Behind him, a middle-aged man in a baseball cap muttered, maybe he should just pay cash. Another voice, a younger woman's, responded, or maybe they should stop assuming things. The tension was spreading, rippling through the line. Blake turned toward the intercom. Jared, can you come to Register 3? I need verification on a declined transaction. Shaq let out a slow breath, steadying himself. He had walked into this store expecting a normal day. Instead, he had walked into something far more familiar. Something he had hoped, after all these years, wouldn't happen anymore. But here it was. Again. And the whole store was watching. A hush fell over the store as Blake picked up the intercom and paged the manager. The distant murmur of shoppers faded, replaced by a thick, heavy silence laced with curiosity and doubt. Shaq stood still, his broad shoulders squared, his face unreadable. He had been here before. Not in this exact store, not with these exact people, but in this exact moment. A moment where perception outweighed truth, where quiet prejudice whispered louder than reason. Blake tapped his fingers against the register, his eyes flicking toward Shaq's hoodie again. His expression remained neutral, but there was something in his gaze, a hesitation, a presumption, that didn't sit right. He exhaled sharply and muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." Shaq heard it. So did the woman in line behind him. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice laced with irritation. She was in her early 40s, dressed in business casual attire, her blonde hair tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail. "Did you just—" Blake ignored her and focused on the approaching figure of Jared, the store manager. Jared was a wiry man in his late 30s, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and slacks. His expression was one of mild annoyance, as if being called to the front for something so trivial was beneath him. He walked briskly, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor, and stopped just short of the register. "What's the problem?" Blake gestured toward Shaq without making direct eye contact. "This gentleman's card declined. Twice." Jared barely looked at Shaq before shifting his attention to the screen. "And?" Blake lowered his voice, but not enough to keep Shaq from hearing. "I just think we should verify." Shaq clenched his jaw. He wasn't naive. He knew exactly what was happening. Jared straightened, finally looking at him. "Sir, do you have another form of payment?" Shaq's voice remained even. "I've got plenty, but my card shouldn't be declining. Run it again." Jared hesitated. Then, another voice cut through the moment, a low, firm tone from near the store's entrance. "Travis." The security guard had been watching the whole exchange from a distance, his stance shifting from passive to alert. He was tall, broad, and built like someone who took his job a little too seriously. As soon as he heard the word declined and saw Jared's uncertain expression, he started making his way toward them. His heavy boots thudded against the floor, each step deliberate. His hand hovered near his belt, not in a threatening way, but as if he was preparing for something to go wrong. Shaq saw him coming and took a slow breath. This was getting out of hand. The customers in line began whispering amongst themselves. A man in his 50s, wearing a worn-out baseball cap, leaned toward his wife and muttered, "Bet it's a stolen card." Another man, younger and sharper dressed, scoffed. "Do you even know who that is?" A woman near the magazine rack pulled out her phone, subtly recording the scene. Jared crossed his arms. "Sir, I'm just following store policy." Shaq exhaled through his nose, holding back the frustration threatening to rise. He had been patient. He had given them every chance to handle this the right way. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Fine," he said. "Let's settle this." Blake tensed. "What are you doing?" "Calling my bank." The whispering grew louder. Someone let out a short, amused laugh. "That's right. Let the man call his damn bank." Jared glanced at Travis, exchanging a silent understanding. They were both uneasy now, the situation shifting out of their control. Shaq tapped his phone screen, putting the call on speaker. The dial tone buzzed once, twice. Then a crisp, professional voice answered. "Thank you for calling First National Banking. How can I assist you today?" Shaq's voice remained level. "Yeah. I need to check on a transaction. My card just got declined, and I know for a fact there's no issue with my account." "Certainly, sir. Can you verify your account number?" Shaq provided the details. The cashier, the manager, the security guard. Everyone stood frozen, listening as the banking representative worked through the system. A pause, then, "Mr. O'Neal, I see no issues on our end. Your card is fully active, and there are no declined transactions in our records." The air in the store shifted. Blake's face drained of color. Jared's posture stiffened. Shaq tilted his head slightly. "You're sure?" "Yes, sir. Your account is in perfect standing." Shaq let that sink in for a moment before responding. "Appreciate it." He ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket. Then he looked at Blake, then at Jared, then at Travis. "So," he said, voice steady but laced with something heavier now. "What's really going on here?" Jared opened his mouth, then closed it. Blake shifted uncomfortably. Then the woman from before, the one who had called out Blake earlier, stepped forward, her arms crossed. "I'll tell you what's going on," she said, voice sharp. "This is what racial profiling looks like." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded. Others looked away, uncomfortable. Blake held up his hands defensively. "That's not what—" But before he could finish, another voice chimed in. "Yeah, you just assumed he was up to something," said a young man in line, arms folded. "Bet if it was me, you wouldn't have called your manager." Blake turned toward Jared, seeking support. But Jared was silent now, staring down at the register screen as if hoping it would swallow him whole. Shaq finally spoke again, slow and deliberate. "I came in here to buy some groceries." He glanced at the crowd, then back at the men in front of him. "And instead I got treated like a criminal." Jared cleared his throat, scrambling to regain control. "Mr. O'Neal, please understand." "I understand plenty." Another murmur from the crowd. Jared exhaled sharply, realizing there was no way out of this without consequence. "Sir, I apologize if—" Shaq's brow lifted. "If—" Jared swallowed. His voice came quieter. "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Blake's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Shaq let the moment linger before speaking again. "I don't need your apology. I need you to be better." Then, without another word, he grabbed his wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and set it on the counter. "For the groceries," he said. Blake hesitated before reaching for the cash, but Shaq didn't wait. He turned, stepping away from the register, the weight of 1,000 unspoken words hanging in the air. As he walked toward the exit, the store was silent, except for the occasional rustle of bags, the shuffle of feet, and the unshaken whisper of truth that had settled over every soul in the building. Somewhere near the back, the woman with the ponytail muttered, "Damn shame." And then, just as Shaq reached the doors, a voice rang out. "Hey, wait." He turned. A man stepped forward from the crowd. And in that moment, Shaq knew. This wasn't over. The tension inside Harper's Market had thickened like an approaching storm. The air felt heavy, charged with something unseen but deeply felt. Shaq stood still, his towering frame unmoving, as Jared, the store manager, stood across from him, arms crossed, face set in quiet judgment. The accusation had not been spoken outright, but it didn't need to be. It hung between them, unspoken, yet deafening. The whispers from the customers had grown louder, feeding off the silent confrontation. Some had their phones out, pretending to check messages while discreetly recording. Others simply watched, wide-eyed, waiting to see how it would unfold. Jared cleared his throat and folded his arms tighter. "Sir, if both of your cards have been declined, we have to assume—" Shaq cut him off. His voice was still calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "Assume what?" Jared hesitated for only a second before pressing forward. "That the card isn't valid." Shaq let out a slow breath, steadying himself. "I just got off the phone with my bank. My account is fine. There's no issue with my card." Jared shook his head as if that explanation wasn't good enough. "Then why did it decline?" Shaq could feel the judgment in the man's voice, the weight of his assumption. He had been through moments like this before. Subtle, quiet accusations dressed up as standard procedure. He had never liked confrontation, never enjoyed the feeling of having to prove his worth in a world that too often made up its mind before the truth even had a chance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another card. "Fine. Here's a different one." But Jared didn't take it. Instead, he let out a sharp sigh and shook his head again. "Sir, if the first two were declined, we can't keep running cards. That's not how this works." Shaq narrowed his eyes. "That's exactly how it works." Blake, the cashier, shifted uncomfortably beside Jared, but he didn't speak up. He just glanced at the register screen, then back at Jared, waiting for him to handle it. A voice from the line behind Shaq broke the silence. "This is ridiculous," a young woman said, her arms crossed. "If it was anyone else, you'd have run the card again." A man in a flannel jacket scoffed. "He probably doesn't even have an account with that bank." Shaq turned his head slightly, locking eyes with the man. For a brief moment, the store felt smaller, the walls closing in. Another customer, an older man with silver hair, shifted uneasily. "Look, either let him pay or let him leave, but this is getting ridiculous." Jared's jaw tightened. He knew people were watching now, really watching. He could feel the heat of their stares, the shift in the air as the situation started slipping from his control. Shaq placed the new card down on the counter, his voice dropping lower. "Run it." But Jared didn't move. He hesitated, then shook his head. "No." Shaq's patience thinned. "Why?" Jared inhaled sharply. "Because this entire thing seems suspicious." And there it was. The accusation laid bare. A sharp silence followed. It was a silence that carried weight, pressing down on everyone in the store. The woman in the ponytail from before muttered, "Oh, hell no." Shaq exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay steady. His fists clenched at his sides, not in anger, but in restraint. He had played this game before, and he knew the rules. If he got loud, he was aggressive. If he got defensive, he was combative. If he walked away, he was guilty. So instead, he did something else. He laughed. It was a low, humorless chuckle, one that made Jared flinch just slightly. Shaq nodded to himself, running a hand over his face before letting it drop back to his side. "Suspicious," he repeated, shaking his head. "Because a man like me couldn't possibly have a working credit card." Jared shifted his weight, glancing at Travis, the security guard, who still stood nearby, watching. He seemed to be waiting for a cue. And then, from the back of the store, someone lifted their phone higher. The small red dot of a live recording blinked in the dim store lighting. This was being broadcast. Shaq saw it but didn't acknowledge it. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned back to Jared, his voice quieter now, but just as firm. "Run. The card." Jared hesitated for too long. His eyes flicked toward Blake, then toward the growing crowd, then toward the security guard. He knew he had already lost, but pride kept him standing there, frozen in the weight of his own decision. And then, as if the universe itself wanted to push the moment further, a notification pinged loudly from someone's phone in the crowd. A murmur rippled through the customers. Someone let out a short, sharp breath of disbelief. Then, "Yo, this is live." Jared's spine went rigid. The video had already spread beyond the store's walls. The weight of the moment shifted again. No longer was this just a quiet standoff between a store manager and a customer. It was now something bigger, something public. Blake swallowed hard, finally glancing at Shaq with something like guilt in his eyes. Travis, the security guard, frowned, realizing too late that he had positioned himself all wrong. Jared cleared his throat. His face was red now, his stance no longer confident but strained. He had two choices: double down or backpedal. For a brief, painful second, it looked like he might choose the former. But then Shaq did something that shattered the last bit of resistance Jared had left. He pulled out his phone and dialed. Jared tensed. "Who are you calling?" Shaq pressed the phone to his ear, waiting. Then, when the line connected, he spoke. Calm, measured, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Yeah," he said. "I need to report an incident of discrimination." Jared paled. A collective murmur spread through the store. Shaq continued, his eyes locked on Jared's. "I'm at Harper's Market on 5th Street. Store manager refused to run my card and accused me of using a fake one." He listened for a moment, then nodded slightly. "No, I haven't left yet. Whole thing is being recorded." Jared's breath caught. His lips parted as if he wanted to interrupt, to stop what was happening. But the words didn't come, because it was too late. Shaq held Jared's gaze for a long, tense moment before lowering the phone and ending the call. Then, he reached down, grabbed his wallet and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, the second one he had placed on the counter. He tossed it lightly onto the conveyor belt. "Here," he said, "since my money's the only thing you seem to trust." Blake flinched at the words. Jared swallowed hard, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Shaq didn't wait for a response. He grabbed his groceries, turned, and walked toward the exit. The customers parted for him. No one spoke. No one dared. The weight of what had just happened would linger far beyond the walls of the store. It was already out there, spreading across screens, reaching thousands, soon to be millions. And Jared knew it, knew deep down that this moment would follow him for a long, long time. Because some accusations can't be taken back, and some moments change everything. Blake, the cashier, kept his eyes down, fingers gripping the edge of the register like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. And then, from the middle of the gathering crowd, a voice broke through the silence. "Well, this is getting out of hand." The voice belonged to a man in his early 40s, dressed in a navy blue blazer over a crisp white shirt. His neatly combed dark hair and sharp eyes gave him a polished, authoritative look. He had been standing quietly near the self-checkout section, observing everything, his phone in hand. Jared turned, frowning. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." The man smirked slightly. "Actually, it does." Shaq glanced at him, studying his demeanor. There was something about him. Calm, confident, in control. He wasn't just a bystander. The man stepped forward, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Name's Landon Reese, and if you must know, I've been watching this whole mess unfold." Jared exhaled sharply, folding his arms. "Sir, we're just following protocol. A declined card requires verification. That's store policy." Shaq let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Funny how that policy only applies to people who look like me." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably. Blake cleared his throat. "It's not about that," he mumbled. "It's just suspicious circumstances." Landon raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious, huh?" He pulled out his phone again. "Tell me something. Was it suspicious enough to be broadcast live to about 100,000 people?" Jared's face drained of color. The murmurs grew louder as people pulled out their own phones, checking social media. The video had gone viral in real time. Comment sections were exploding. "Holy crap," a teenage girl near the magazines muttered, scrolling furiously. "This is blowing up." A middle-aged man in a work jacket frowned at his screen. "Man, this is a bad look for this place." Jared swallowed hard. This is being blown out of proportion." Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "No, Jared. This is exactly what it looks like." Landon smirked, tilting his phone to show the manager the screen. Check the comments. Jared hesitated, then leaned in slightly. His eyes darted across the feed. Wow, racial profiling in broad daylight. This is disgusting. I can't believe they're doing this to Shaq of all people. Imagine what happens to regular folks. Harper's Market is about to get canceled. Blake shifted on his feet, suddenly looking very, very small. Landon turned to Shaq. Mind if I make a quick call? Shaq gave him a slow nod. Be my guest. Landon pressed a contact on his phone and lifted it to his ear. The crowd quieted, listening. Jared clenched his jaw, watching the man with growing anxiety. The line rang once, twice. Then, Hey, it's me, Landon said smoothly. Yeah, I need a favor. Jared's hands curled into fists. Who are you calling? Landon didn't answer. Instead, he listened for a few moments, nodded, then smirked. Oh, you're watching it live? Good, then you already know why I'm calling. Shaq watched him closely. Whoever Landon was talking to, they held power. Real power. Landon turned slightly, locking eyes with Jared. Give me 2 minutes, yeah, I'll wait. He lowered the phone just slightly and grinned. Hope you're ready for this, Jared. Jared was about to snap back when the store's landline rang. The sudden shrill sound cut through the tense silence like a blade. Blake jumped. Jared's face went pale. The phone rang again, and again. The assistant manager, a nervous-looking woman in her late 20s, hesitated before picking it up. Harper's Market, this is Diane. A pause. Then her face blanched. Yes, sir. He's right here. She turned, wide-eyed, holding out the phone toward Jared. Jared hesitated. His fingers twitched. Who is it? He asked, though the dread in his voice suggested he already knew. Diane swallowed. It's the bank. Jared stiffened. A fresh wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Shaq folded his arms, watching. Landon smirked. Told you. Jared took the phone, clearing his throat. This is Jared. The other end of the line was silent for a beat. Then, a voice cut through, deep, measured, professional. Jared, this is Nathan Caldwell, Senior Vice President at First National Banking. I just received an urgent report regarding a declined transaction at your store. A transaction that, according to our system, never actually happened. Jared's stomach twisted. I don't know what you mean. Nathan's voice remained cool. I mean that Mr. O'Neal's card was never declined. There is no record of a failed transaction attempt, which means the issue isn't with his bank. It's with you. The weight of those words crushed down on Jared like a stone. The store was so quiet now, he could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. Shaq arched an eyebrow. Well, would you look at that? Blake visibly gulped, his hands now gripping the counter so hard his knuckles turned white. Nathan continued. Mr. O'Neal has been a long-standing client of our bank. His accounts are in perfect standing, and there is absolutely no reason for his card to be flagged. So I'll ask you this, Jared. Why wasn't his transaction processed? Jared opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He looked at Blake, who looked just as lost. The silence stretched. The crowd waited. Finally, Jared muttered, It must have been an error. Shaq let out a slow, knowing chuckle. An error, huh? Landon shook his head. An error that only seemed to happen to him. Nathan's voice hardened. I suggest you rectify this situation immediately. Otherwise, I will personally ensure that every Harper's Market account with our bank is, how should I put this, reevaluated. Jared's stomach dropped. That was not a threat. That was a promise. The store owner, Mr. Caldwell, had accounts tied directly to First National Banking. Losing their business could cripple the store's financial standing. Jared swallowed hard. I understand, sir. Nathan didn't respond right away. Then, in a lower, sharper tone, he said, You have exactly 60 seconds to fix this. Click. The line went dead. Jared slowly set the phone down. His hands were trembling. His career, his reputation, all of it was hanging by a thread. Landon clapped a hand on Shaq's shoulder. I think we're done here. Shaq gave Jared one last look, then turned toward the exit. But before he left, he paused. Then, in a voice that carried through the store, he said, "If this happened to me, someone you can Google in 2 seconds, imagine how often it happens to people who don't have a platform." A heavy silence followed. Jared had no response. Blake looked like he wanted to disappear. And as Shaq walked out the doors, the store erupted into a flurry of whispers, camera flashes, and a single undeniable truth. This wasn't just a moment. It was a reckoning. The air outside Harper's Market was thick with the sound of murmuring voices, camera shutters clicking, and the occasional honk of a car that had slowed down to see what was happening. The small-town grocery store, which had once been just another stop for daily errands, had now become the epicenter of a national conversation. Shaq had left the building, but the storm he had unintentionally ignited was just beginning. It started as a trickle, locals stopping in front of the store, refreshing their social media feeds, whispering to one another. Then, within the hour, it turned into something much bigger. A group of people had gathered near the entrance, some holding their phones up, streaming live. Others watched the unfolding chaos through their screens as news anchors from major networks started reporting on the incident. Breaking news. Viral video exposes alleged racial profiling at Harper's Market. Shaquille O'Neal caught in shocking confrontation. Was he targeted? Public outrage grows as footage of denied transaction spreads. As the sun started to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the parking lot, more people arrived. Some were activists, drawn by the urgency of the moment. Others were everyday citizens, angered by what they had seen. And then there were the reporters, their cameras trained on the store's glass doors, waiting for something, anything to happen next. Inside, the tension had not eased. Jared stood behind the register, his fingers digging into his arms as he watched the event spiral further out of control. Blake had retreated to the back office, his face pale, his hands clammy. The store's employees whispered amongst themselves, some stealing glances at the chaos outside. And then, the front doors swung open with force. A man in his 60s, dressed in a charcoal gray suit with a crisp white shirt, strode inside with purpose. His silver-streaked hair was neatly combed, his expression unreadable, but his presence alone sent a ripple of awareness through the staff. It was Mr. Caldwell, the owner of Harper's Market. Jared straightened instinctively, his heart pounding. He hadn't expected Caldwell to get involved this quickly. He certainly hadn't expected him to show up in person. Caldwell didn't waste time. His gaze swept across the store before landing on Jared. "My office," he said, voice clipped. "Now." Jared hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded stiffly and followed. The back office was small, cluttered with stacks of paperwork and a desk that had seen better days. Caldwell didn't bother sitting. He simply turned, arms crossed, and fixed Jared with a look so sharp it could have sliced through steel. "Do you have any idea what kind of mess you've made?" Jared swallowed hard. "Sir, I was just..." "Just what?" Caldwell snapped. "Because from what I saw in that video, you weren't just following protocol. You were making a mistake so big it might cost us this store." Jared's mouth went dry. Caldwell took a deep breath, running a hand through his graying hair. "I have corporate breathing down my neck. We've got legal teams calling, PR teams scrambling, and all because you refused to let a man, a well-respected man I might add, pay for his damn groceries." Jared exhaled shakily. I thought the card was fake." Caldwell's eyes flashed. "Based on what?" Jared hesitated. There was no answer that wouldn't make him look worse. Caldwell let the silence stretch, then shook his head in disgust. "Tell me, Jared, do you know what happens when our store gets labeled as the place that racially profiles customers?" Jared felt his stomach twist. Caldwell turned toward the desk, grabbed the mouse, and clicked on an open tab on the computer screen. The store's official website was already being flooded with comments. "I'm never shopping here again. Shut this place down. Hope everyone involved gets fired. Disgusting." The reviews were tanking. The store's reputation was being shredded in real time. Caldwell leaned back, crossing his arms again. "You see the damage now?" Jared nodded stiffly. He saw it. He just didn't know how to fix it. Caldwell exhaled through his nose and turned back toward the door. "Come with me." Jared hesitated, but followed. When they stepped back onto the store floor, Blake was standing near the registers, looking even worse than before. His eyes darted between Caldwell and Jared, as if searching for a lifeline. Caldwell walked past them, heading straight for the front doors. He stepped outside, facing the growing crowd. The second he appeared, the murmurs turned to full-blown shouts. Reporters pushed forward, microphones extended. "Mr. Caldwell, are you aware of what happened in your store today? What action will you be taking against the employees involved? Do you believe racial bias played a role in this incident?" Caldwell held up a hand, silencing them. Then, with the world watching, he spoke. "First and foremost, I want to say this. What happened today was unacceptable." The crowd quieted slightly, waiting. Caldwell continued, his voice steady. "Harper's Market does not and will not tolerate discrimination in any form. I have personally reviewed the footage, and I am deeply disappointed in what I saw." Blake and Jared stood frozen inside the store, their faces drained of color. "I want to extend a personal apology to Mr. O'Neal," Caldwell went on. "Not just for the inconvenience, but for the humiliation he endured because of the poor judgment of my staff." A murmur spread through the crowd. The reporters scribbled furiously. Caldwell turned slightly. "As of this moment, we are conducting a full internal review. Those responsible will be held accountable." Jared's throat tightened. He knew what was coming before Caldwell even said it. "This includes the immediate termination of store manager Jared Whitman and cashier Blake Rogers." Blake let out a small, choked sound, as if the air had just been knocked from his lungs. Jared felt like the ground had vanished beneath him. The crowd erupted. Some cheered. Others nodded in approval. Caldwell wasn't finished. "Furthermore, we will be implementing mandatory bias training for all employees, and we will be working closely with community leaders to ensure that Harper's Market is a place where everyone, no matter who they are, is treated with fairness and respect." A wave of applause followed. Caldwell took one last look at the crowd, then turned and walked back inside, where Jared and Blake stood, stunned and motionless. Jared finally found his voice. "Sir, please, I was only trying to—" Caldwell didn't even look at him. "Clean out your locker." Blake tried to speak, but nothing came out. Caldwell looked at Diane, the assistant manager. "You're in charge now. Make sure everything runs smoothly." She nodded quickly, avoiding Jared's gaze. Caldwell turned, walking toward his office without another word. Jared stood there for a long moment, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. Blake swallowed hard, then turned toward the exit. When he stepped outside, the crowd saw him, and the reaction was immediate. People stared. Some shook their heads, others pointed their phones at him. Jared followed, and the second he stepped through the doors, someone shouted, "Hope it was worth it." He didn't respond. He just kept walking, past the cameras, past the judgment, past the moment that had changed everything. Because once the world takes notice, there's no going back. The video of Shaq's confrontation with the store's management had now reached millions, sparking outrage and debate. But inside the store, the atmosphere had shifted. The damage had been done, and everyone knew it. Mr. Caldwell sat behind his office desk, his hands clasped together as he studied Jared and Blake, who stood in front of him like schoolboys waiting for discipline. Their faces were pale, their confidence shattered. The reality of their choices had finally caught up with them. Caldwell exhaled slowly, then leaned forward. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What happened today was more than just bad judgment. It was a failure, on both of your parts." Jared's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Blake swallowed hard. "Sir, I didn't mean—" Caldwell cut him off with a sharp look. Don't tell me you didn't mean for this to happen. You made assumptions. You let your bias dictate your actions, and now this store, this entire company, is facing the consequences." Blake looked down, shame creeping up his face. Jared shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, Caldwell raised a hand. "Enough. I should fire you both on the spot. And frankly, I still might." Jared's breath caught. Blake clenched his fists, as if holding back the urge to plead. Caldwell studied them for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "But here's the thing," he said, voice measured. "Shaquille O'Neal, despite everything you put him through, is willing to give you a choice. Jared and Blake exchanged confused glances, and then, as if on cue, the door opened. Shaq stepped inside. His presence filled the room, not just because of his size, but because of the sheer weight of what he represented in this moment. He wasn't just a wronged customer. He was the symbol of everything this incident had exposed. Caldwell gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Mr. O'Neal, please." Shaq lowered himself into the seat, his movements slow, deliberate. His eyes flickered toward Jared and Blake, but there was no anger in them, just something deeper. Something that made them both shift uncomfortably under his gaze. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Shaq finally broke the silence. "I've been in situations like this before," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I've walked into places where people looked at me and saw a threat instead of a person, saw a stereotype instead of a man." Jared's eyes dropped to the floor. Blake let out a shaky breath. Shaq continued, "You assumed I didn't belong, that my money wasn't real, that I was, what, a scammer? A thief?" Blake flinched at the word. Shaq leaned forward slightly. "I could walk out of here right now, let the world chew you up, let you lose your jobs, your reputation, everything. And part of me thinks that's exactly what should happen." Jared swallowed hard. "Mr. O'Neal, Shaq held up a massive hand, stopping him. "But then what?" he said. "You lose your jobs. Maybe you go home angry, bitter. Maybe you tell yourselves you were canceled instead of facing the real problem. Maybe you learn nothing." Caldwell watched the exchange silently, his expression unreadable. Shaq exhaled slowly. "So I'm giving you a choice." Jared and Blake both lifted their heads. "You can walk out of here, deal with the fallout, and go on with your lives. Or," Shaq's eyes locked onto them, "you can own what you did, publicly." Jared stiffened. "You mean?" Shaq nodded. "Go outside. Face that crowd. Acknowledge your mistake. Not a half-baked apology. Not, 'I'm sorry if anyone was offended.' A real apology. Admit what you did, why you did it, and why it was wrong." Blake's mouth opened, but no words came out. Jared exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "That crowd will eat us alive." Shaq shrugged. "That's the price you pay when you mess up. You don't get to walk away clean." Caldwell tapped his fingers on the desk, considering. Then he turned to Jared and Blake. "Well?" Blake hesitated, then looked at Jared. Jared swallowed hard, his throat dry. He thought about everything: the job, his reputation, the public humiliation waiting outside. He thought about how, just hours ago, he had felt completely in control, how quickly that power had crumbled. Then he looked at Shaq. There was no malice in his eyes, no vengeance, just expectation. Jared exhaled. Then quietly, he nodded. Blake's hands trembled at his sides, but he forced out the word. "Okay." Caldwell stood. "Then let's go." They moved toward the front of the store. The closer they got, the louder the noise became. The crowd outside was restless, waiting for justice. The doors swung open. The moment Jared and Blake stepped outside, the noise exploded. Reporters surged forward. People shouted. Cameras flashed. Caldwell stepped to the side, allowing them to face the crowd alone. Jared took a shaky breath. Then he stepped forward. The crowd quieted, waiting. Jared's voice wavered at first, but he forced himself to speak. "I messed up," he said. "Badly." A hush fell over the crowd. Jared swallowed. "I made an assumption about a customer based on his appearance. I judged him unfairly, and I was wrong." Blake shifted, looking like he wanted to disappear, but he stepped forward anyway. "We let our own bias affect our judgment. We embarrassed someone who didn't deserve it, and for that, we're sorry." Somewhere in the crowd, someone scoffed. "Sorry's not enough." Shaq, who had been standing near the doors, finally spoke. "It's not about the apology. It's about the change that comes after." Silence followed. Then, slowly, the anger in the crowd began to shift. Not disappear, not entirely, but soften. Some nodded, others muttered amongst themselves. A few even put their phones down. Jared felt the tension in his chest loosen, just slightly. Shaq stepped forward, placing a massive hand on Jared's shoulder. "Now do better," he said simply. Then, without another word, he walked away. The moment stayed with everyone. Because in the end, this wasn't just about a grocery store. It wasn't just about a declined card. It was about something much bigger. And maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something better. The sun had begun its slow descent over Harper's Market, casting a warm, golden hue over the restless crowd. The tension that had filled the air just hours ago had shifted into something else. Something unspoken, yet powerful. Shaquille O'Neal stood near the store entrance, his presence commanding yet calm. He had been quiet ever since Jared and Blake had delivered their public apology. He had listened to their words, watched their expressions, and studied the emotions flickering across the faces of the people around him. Now, it was his turn to speak. The reporters, the bystanders, and even the store employees fell silent as Shaq stepped forward, his massive frame towering over the scene. He took a deep breath, his voice steady, yet filled with something deeper, something that made the weight of this moment undeniable. "I could sue," Shaq began, his voice carrying through the parking lot. "I could take this store to court, make headlines, drag this out for months, make an example out of them." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement. Others waited, unsure of where this was going. "But I'm not going to." The silence deepened. Even Jared and Blake, standing off to the side, looked confused. Shaq turned his gaze toward them, his expression unreadable. "You know why?" No one answered. Shaq exhaled slowly. "Because this isn't just about me." He looked out at the crowd, at the faces of those who had come, at the phones still recording, at the people watching from their screens all over the country. This is about every person who's ever been judged before they got the chance to prove who they really are. Every person who's ever been followed in a store for looking suspicious. Every person who's ever had to smile through an insult, stay calm through an accusation, walk away when they had every right to stand their ground. A woman near the front wiped a tear from her eye. Shaq's voice didn't waver. "Today it was me, but what about tomorrow? What about the kid who walks in wearing a hoodie and gets told he doesn't belong? What about the mother paying with cash who gets double-checked like she's a criminal? What about the father who's just trying to buy dinner for his family but gets humiliated instead?" Jared swallowed hard. Blake looked down at his shoes. Shaq turned his gaze back to them. "You thought you were just doing your jobs. But your job isn't to assume. Your job isn't to judge. Your job is to treat people like people." The weight of his words settled over them like a heavy stone. Shaq looked toward Mr. Caldwell, who stood near the store entrance, his expression serious. "Something needs to change." Caldwell nodded once, already knowing what was coming. "In the next few weeks," Shaq continued, "Harper's Market is going to implement new policies, bias training for every employee, a system that ensures no one gets singled out because of how they look. And if that doesn't happen," his eyes locked onto Caldwell's, "you'll be hearing from me again." Caldwell didn't hesitate. "It'll happen." Shaq gave a small nod. Then he turned back to the crowd. "I'm not a victim," he said. "I'm not walking away from this angry or bitter. I'm walking away with my head high. Because at the end of the day, dignity isn't something anyone can take from you. It's something you choose to keep." A heavy pause. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single clap, then another. And then, like a rising wave, the applause swelled, echoing across the parking lot, growing louder, more powerful, until it was a full-fledged standing ovation. Shaq didn't smile. He didn't need to. He had said what needed to be said. With one last glance toward the store, he turned and walked away, his silhouette illuminated by the setting sun. Not as a victim, not as just a man, but as a symbol. A symbol of resilience, dignity, and the power of choosing to be better. Moments like this happen every day, to people without cameras, without fame, without a voice. Shaq's story made headlines, but how many go unnoticed? How many people walk away unheard, unseen, and unspoken for? It's time to change that. If you believe in fairness, dignity, and standing against discrimination, be part of the conversation. Share this story. Speak up when you see injustice. Challenge bias wherever it hides. Because the next time this happens, the world might not be watching, but you will be.